And we can start in each case by saying, what is the truth that underlies the accusation or the sort of the smear behind each one of these ones. And we mentioned chofshi mikfiat datit, means so free from religious coercion, chofshi megizanut, free from racism, and chofshi ishtamtut, free from evasion or draft dodging. So those are three. I don't know if that was the whole campaign, but those are three that I remember seeing driving around. So first of all, with chofshi mikfiat datit, the kinds of issues that that's probably referring to, if we're talking about recent news, so religious coercion, what kinds of religious coercion are people worried about? Because obviously there's this great fear of, oh, well, if you get rid of the Supreme Court, then of course, all the Jews who want to keep the Torah, the first thing they're going to want to do is use the brute force of mass democracy to vote for laws that will force Jews who don't want to keep the Torah to keep the Torah. And that's the sort of a fear-mongering caricature, although there's relatively little evidence that something like that really is in the offing. But I think people point to things that they say are sort of the telltale signs, and they pick up on. So what are these different examples? So one would be trains running on Shabbat, or construction on train lines being allowed to happen on Shabbat. These are things that particular political parties have made issues out of. For example, Haredi political parties, so these sort of ultra-Orthodox, as they're sometimes called, parties, and others as well. So that's one kind of issue. There was also, in the last few years, politics made out of the issue of chametz on Pesach in hospitals. Because first, when the health ministry was controlled by the far-left Meretz party in the last government, there was more leniency about allowing people to bring bring leavened bread-like products, chametz, in hospitals, which had previously, by convention, not been allowed during Pesach, when we're not supposed to have it in our dwelling, according to the Torah. And then Idit Silman, who had been a member of that government, was instrumental in bringing down the government. And for her, that was kind of the last straw, because she said it was an issue of the Jewish character of the state. And then this time around during Pesach, there were all of these people photographing themselves, bringing chametz into hospitals deliberately, because now it was not allowed, and they wanted to do some kind of protest movement of Chilul Hashem, which I think was rather pointless and nasty. But in any case, it was about showing that, yeah, in a free country, we really should be able to do whatever we want, and the hospitals can't make rules for us like this, and that's terrible. So it was a sort of wedge issue. People made political hay out of it in either direction, and so people would say, "Look, that's a clear example where I don't want that kind of religious coercion, that kfiyat datit. If I don't myself, although I am in some sense a Jew, I don't want to keep the laws of Passover. I don't care about whether I'm eating chametz or not, or possessing chametz. And then, I would like to just go to a hospital and bring my sandwich with me to visit a loved one who's in the hospital. And then you're going to tell me that because of some religion that I don't believe in, that I can't." That's the way of making the argument, it would seem. And there's something similar with the train lines also, right? Where why should everyone be subordinate to the fact that some people want to keep Shabbat? If I want to, take a train to somewhere, or I want my train lines to be built faster so I want the work to be done on Shabbat. So that is, let's say the argument that is maybe, I don't know if I'm making the best possible argument, but it's certainly a reasonable one, trying to represent the position of someone who's saying, yeah, so this is like a real thing I should be concerned about. If the Supreme Court isn't, acting as a battering ram for me, or as sort of a nanny for everyone, then I might be subject to religious coercion that's, not acceptable. I think we can address this one. This is sort of a shorter vignette before moving on to see the other two, which are more sort of entangled, although really all three of them are related. By just saying, first of all, whenever people bring up issues like this as a way of making political hay for their side of this argument, I've never heard someone arguing against judicial reform at the same time trying to be fully fair-minded about what, for example, religious coercion really means and amounts to. Meaning, you could imagine someone saying, look, I want real freedom of religion in this country, and I want it across the board. So, for example, I want it to be the case that I'm not forced to not bring chametz into a hospital because that somehow is, forcing someone else's religion on me. And I also want Jews to be free to pray on the Temple Mount because people of all religions should be equally free to pray there, right? Maybe we can find such a person, but I don't find in general the people who are really up in arms about bringing chametz into hospitals are also really scandalized by, I would argue, the much greater violation of religious freedom that happens all the time on the Temple Mount, where officially it's illegal for Jews to pray there. Police can arrest them for it. Jews, in fact, do pray there. They're escorted around by police so that they're not being attacked while doing so. And if they ever do something too overt, like bow or do something with their hands that looks like they're praying, then they can be warned that they're going to be arrested if they do it again. So that sounds to me like textbook religious oppression and persecution. And it's of little or no concern to the vast majority of people who are in favor of billboards saying chofshi mikfiya datit, one can say empirically. And that already is kind of a sign that that's not really what the discussion is about here. So that's one kind of point, is that we could have one kind of conversation about a kind of American First Amendment type of definition of freedom of religion and freedom from religious coercion, and whether that's something we can achieve here in the Jewish state, or whether that's kind of a confused contradiction in terms, if this is going to be a state with a different kind of constitution or raison d'etre than the United States of America has. But that's not seemingly what the discussion is that anyone's really asking for anyway. They're just trying to do the fear mongering of saying, look, someone's going to come and try to make you light candles or put on tefillin or whatever, and use the long arm of the state to make you do that. And isn't that terrible? And I will say, also, like, the other thing that we didn't mention earlier, trying to make kind of the best argument in someone else's favor, is there are people in the state of Israel who are not particularly careful in worrying about not producing that impression, right? So some religious Jews, they're very concerned about making sure that they get to keep the Torah correctly, and also concerned about how to use the state to make it easier for their constituency to do what it wants to do. And if here and there that steps on some people's toes or makes inconveniences for them, that isn't the principal worry, right? That does happen. And so it should not be claimed that it's never been the case that the state of Israel has produced inconvenience for people. For example, in marriage, right? Like in these places that are unavoidable, where the political and the let's say legislative unavoidably collide with the religious, where you can't say, oh, let's just do religion over here and politics over there, because in the middle you have a state, and a state has to recognize marriages and has to decide which marriages to recognize and which conversions to recognize, so people can make can immigrate to Israel under the law of return and things like that. And then suddenly it's a question of who gets to decide that. And in the current situation, we have a chief rabbinate, as Bar-Hayim has pointed out, styled after the chief rabbinate of the United Kingdom from when this was a British colonial holding of sorts. And that rabbinate can be controlled by a particular sector, not just of the Jewish world, but of the religious world. And we can all be hostage to the standards set by that sector. And so there are a lot of Israelis who find it so unpleasant and inconvenient to deal with the requirements of getting married according to the law here in Israel that they go somewhere else so they can get married outside the country as a loophole. And the tragedy of that is that some of them might have wanted a religious marriage, but they just didn't want to deal with the requirements of the rabbinate, which is not completely synonymous with all conceivable standards for what a halakhically Jewish marriage should look like. So that, it all has to be acknowledged. There are plenty of people who already chafe at aspects of what you could call kfiyah datit. And so they're really saying, when they say chofshim kfiyah datit, it's referring to that stuff and to the, trained construction on Shabbat or whatever stuff, but it's not in a principled way. It's not saying, and we also really want freedom of religion, so Jews who want to pray on Har HaBayit should be able to pray on Har HaBayit. Or at least the number of people who are careful enough to be consistent and sincere and lacking in hypocrisy on this particular issue is vanishingly small. If we're talking about polling those who vehemently oppose the judicial reform and do so because they think the Supreme Court is a bulwark against what they would call religious coercion, but it's also the case that they deeply believe in freedom of religious expression for Jews in all of the state of Israel, including the Temple Mount. And they also believe, because no one would believe this, and they also believe that the Supreme Court will do everything it can to protect the religious freedom of Jews in places such as the Temple Mount, because that obviously is a laughing stock to anyone, even, I would imagine, to a person who has some kind of pure American First Amendment notion of religious freedom. So there we've touched on the issue of kfiyah datit, and I think we'll get back into it once we can roll it together with some of the other ones. So chofshim kfiyah datit, really what it's saying is there are times when the religious people in this society make life inconvenient for you, and so you kind of don't like them. Well, they're gonna make it even worse for you if the Supreme Court is weakened. And you should worry about that and mistrust them and fear what they are scheming to do to you if only Supreme Court were, taken out of the way. And so it's fear-mongering, but it's obviously, as all fear-mongering, it's fear-mongering that has some basis in problems that have arisen in the past.
We would like to encourage our viewers to share these videos with friends and send in your responses. If you would like to obtain Birkon Nusach Eretz Yisrael or invite the rabbi for a speaking engagement, please email us at office@machonshilo.org.